So here's another way of thinking about what I want to talk with you about: common language, common sense, and common ground. And we're going to start with common language. And by that, I don't mean English versus French versus other languages. I'm talking about our ability to talk to each other clearly and communicate. It occurred to me the other day that none of you would get on an airplane, or none of you would submit yourself to surgery if you honestly believed that the pilots or the surgeons couldn't agree on the words they were going to use, right? That would be a dangerous thing to do. And yet I think the work that you all are doing on the well-being of children, families, communities is every bit as complicated as flying an airplane, but we're very undisciplined about language. And as a consequence of that, I think sometimes we're actually dangerous. So we're going to start with common language. Common sense is about the way the rest of the world works. If you look at any serious, successful human enterprise, business is always held up to us folks in government and the nonprofit sector as how we ought to model our behavior. How many of you folks here have private sector business experience in your backgrounds? Oh, excellent. Many of you do. Terrific. Look at business. Look at the military. Look at the sports world. Look at the faith community. Any successful human enterprise starts with ends, and it works backwards from ends to means. In business, the end is what? Profit, right, exactly. We have lots of sophisticated ways of measuring the profitability of a company. But look at any of those enterprises. They start with ends, they work backwards to means. In fact, I would suggest to you that everyone does this except us. We get so tied up in the means, a particular program or project or service or initiative, that we oftentimes lose sight of the ends that we're trying to accomplish. And we're going to explore this simple notion in our work, too. It is possible to articulate ends in plain language that taxpayers and voters and constituents can understand, and to use that as the starting point to work backwards to means, because it's just common sense. And finally, common ground. And common ground is about the political nature of this work. And everything we're going to talk about during my time and probably your time, the rest of your time here together, is political in nature. I think you all know this. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Politics is how we make decisions. But look at the political system at the national level, or the provincial level, or the municipal level, or the regional level. And what do you see? You see people fighting with each other. But look at what they're fighting about. And I would submit to you that more often than not, they're fighting about means, they're not fighting about ends. A remarkable agreement across many parts of our society that teen pregnancy is not such a good thing for our young people. Now, this does not mean that teen parents are bad parents. It means that having children too young limits your life chances. Now, so we agree that teen pregnancy is not such a good thing for our young people, but we fight about whether to hand out condoms or to preach abstinence. But that's a means debate. The agreement about teen pregnancy is remarkably broadly based. And when you begin to articulate what it is we want for children, families, elders, communities in plain language, we want children to be born healthy. We want children to be ready for school. We want children to succeed in school. We want them to grow up and be happy, productive, contributing adults. We want to live in safe communities with a clean environment. We want all immigrants and refugees to feel welcome in our society and become full participating members. When you say things in plain language like that, those kinds of statements are not conservative versus liberal. They're not national versus local. They're not executive branch versus legislative branch. They begin to represent a kind of common ground where people can come together and say, well, yes, those are the conditions we would like to be able to say exist here in Ontario or exist here in our community. Now let's see if we can have a healthy debate about the means that'll get us there. So I want to start with common language. And this is another cartoon. It's Mother Goose and Grimm. It's about a woman and her dog. And something terrible has happened to the dog, and the dog rushes in from the outside and leaps on his master and says, "What part of ARF don't you understand?" And some of you will have seen this painting before. It's a depiction of the biblical Tower of Babel. And this is the modern Tower of Babel. And you've seen all these words before, of course, right? Benchmark, outcome, result, goal, indicator, measure, objective, target. Then you get the modifiers in the middle: measurable, urgent, strategic, systemic, incremental. You can also think about this page as the jargon construction kit. If you want to sound fancy about this work, you just pick 3 or 4 of these words at random and you string them together. Measurable, urgent, systemic, indicators. Whatever the hell that means. I guarantee, by the way, if you do this, you will get away with it because people will be too embarrassed to ask you what you mean. I actually have a rule that if anyone uses 3 or more of these words in the same sentence, they don't know what they're talking about. It's very common to find that you have 2 people in the same meeting using the same word, outcome, for example, 2 entirely different ideas about what that word means, and they're just talking right past each other. Have any of you ever had this experience before? Yeah, of course, right. So what we did a couple years ago is we developed a set of definitions that would allow us to have a disciplined conversation about this very complex work that we're trying to do together. Now, the purpose of these definitions is not to impose words or language on people. These words like result and outcome, indicator and benchmark, those words are just labels for ideas. If you think about it for a minute, that's what words are. Words are labels for ideas. And different places have chosen different labels for these ideas. What's important here are not the labels. You can pick whatever labels you like. What's important is that somehow we managed to keep three ideas separate from each other at the beginning of this work. And the first of those ideas we've already been talking about. It's a condition of well-being for children, adults, families, or communities. We mean by this, again, a bottom-line quality of life condition stated in plain language. So, for example, children born healthy, children ready for school, safe communities, clean environment, prosperous economy, bottom-line quality of life conditions. Now, if you define a result this way, and I'm going to use the word result for consistency, if you talk to your friends in England, this framework is used all across England and Australia and New Zealand, but if you talk to your friends in England, they use the word outcome for this idea, and except in Wales. Wales decided to use the word result, and the reason they did that was they said, well, you have a choice about what to call this. And they said, well, what do they call it in England? And I said, well, they call it outcomes. And they said, well, then we're going to call it results. Okay. But except for Wales, everybody else in England calls this outcome, so the whole framework is known as outcome-based accountability. But anyway, so I'm going to use the word result. If you define a result this way, the next thing you want to know is how would we know if we're achieving these quality of life conditions in our community or in our city or in our municipality or region? And we look next to indicators. Some places have called them benchmarks as measures that help quantify the achievement of a result. So for example, the rate of low birth weight babies helps quantify children born healthy. The percentage of children ready at kindergarten entry as measured by the EDI has quantified children ready for school. The crime rate helps quantify safe communities, the air quality index, clean environment, the unemployment rate, prosperous economy. So indicators quantify results at the population level. Now, just a couple of examples that I pulled up from to illustrate this in terms of immigrants and refugees. So a possible result quality of life statement be that all newcomers become full and equal participants in all dimensions of Canadian society. I actually took that wording from the Canadian Council for Refugees work. So that's a statement of ambition about quality of life for immigrants and refugees. An indicator of that might be the percentage of immigrants in stable work and housing 6 months after entry. So that's an example of a measure that might go with this ambition that we state at the result level. So indicators quantify results at the population level. And the third idea, performance measures, are measures of how well a program, agency, or service system is working together. Now, there are many different schemes out there in the world for categorizing performance measures, but I believe that, in fact, all performance measures can fit into one of these three categories. How much did we do? How well did we do it? Is anyone better off? And this last category, the is anyone better off category, we sometimes refer to that as customer results or customer outcomes. And if you do nothing else in terms of your language convention, I encourage you that if you want to talk about a program or service or agency, put a modifier in front of the word result or a modifier in front of the word outcome, customer results or customer outcomes, to distinguish it from the use of those words at the population level at the top. This is the single biggest source of language confusion right now. People are using words like result and outcome interchangeably to mean a customer population and then the total community population, and it hopelessly confuses these two different kinds of accountability. Now, an example down here in terms of refugee and immigration might be the client support program. How much did we do, number of refugees served, how well did we do it, perhaps the percent with a settlement plan in 2 weeks or however many weeks you decide is the standard. But the most important measure here, better off, would be the percentage of served families with a wage earner in stable employment. So those are examples of the kind of quality of life conditions that you're trying to change for individual customers inside a particular service. Now, the distinctions that we're trying to make on this page are principally about the difference between ends and means. Results and indicators are about the quality of life end conditions we hope to achieve. Performance measures tell us whether the particular service we've decided to implement to help us get there is working properly or not. Now, just like Russian dolls with little dolls inside larger dolls, there's another ends-means distinction inside performance accountability where the customer results become the ends and the service delivery strategies then become the means. Is this making sense? Does this make sense? Okay. Now, it's quite common to find that people are working on all these things, but it's usually all mixed up together in a hopeless soup of language. So one minute you're talking about a plain language result, like people are welcome and become full participants in society, and an indicator, like the percent who are in settled employment, or a performance measure, like the percentage of people who show up at LIP meetings every month, as if these were somehow all the same thing, and these distinctions didn't matter. And what happens is when processes mix up ends and means like that is they tend to get stuck, and they start to circle, and they become all talk and talk. And we all have experience with these processes that are all talk, right? Is there anybody here who hasn't had an experience with a process that's all talk? The trick in this work is not the talk. The trick in this work is how do we get from talk to action in a disciplined way. And everything I have to share with you today, every single thing is about that single simple challenge. How do we get from talk to action in a disciplined way? And I think the starting point is to have some kind of common language. So are you willing to take a little test? I want you to tell me if each one of these things is a result, indicator, or performance measure by those definitions. So safe community. What would that be? Result. Crime rate. Indicator. Average police department response time. Performance measure for the police department, right. A world-class workforce. Result. The adult literacy rate. Indicator of that result. People have living wage jobs and income. Result. The percentage of people with living wage jobs and income. Indicator. Percentage of participants in a job training program who get living wage jobs. Performance measure for the job training program, right? Notice how some of these things sound an awful lot alike, right? 6, 7, and 8 sound an awful lot alike, but they're very different. 6, people have living wage jobs and income, is a statement of ambition for all people. We want all people, particularly all immigrants and refugees, to have living wage jobs and income. 7 is exactly like 6, but it has a percentage sign in the front of it, and that makes it a piece of data that helps us measure the extent to which we're getting 6. And 8 is exactly like 7, but 8 is only about the people in this little job training program, whereas 7 has to do with everyone in the community. See the distinctions that we're trying to make here? Okay, good. We're going to skip this page. Now, actually, I'm not going to skip this page. There's something at the back of your package called a tool for choosing a common language, and I just want to show you how this works. You don't have to turn to that page if you don't like, but show you how this works in the event that you want to use this. You know, a lot of the documents you get these days have at the back of them a 20-page glossary. It's like you have to learn a whole new language just to read this document. And part of the reason that happens is that people who invent planning processes think that unless they have defined every word ever used by the planning profession, that their framework must be somehow incomplete. Well, it turns out there are more words out there than there are useful ideas. So we don't start with words. We start instead with ideas. What are the key ideas that we need to keep straight? So for example, a condition of well-being for children, adults, families, and communities. And then the next 2 columns are possible labels for those ideas. So we could label this idea a result or an outcome as they do in England, or a goal, or we could use a modifier, a population result or a community-wide result. Any combination of these and other words is fine, but in the last column you record your choice. And the only rule in filling out this form is that you can only use any word or word combination one time in that last column. And if you were to sit down with a group of people and fill out this form, you don't have to do the whole thing. If you just do 6 or 8 of these items, you'll get pretty far down the road. You will have reached agreement on a common language with the people that you're working with. I was doing this training for the Idaho Division of Special Education a number of years ago, and we had state and local educators in the room together, and we did a 2-day workshop, and at the end of the second day, these people filled out the entire form at the back of your package in 20 minutes. Now, they had been fighting with each other for 20 years about a whole lot of different things, but they reached agreement on language in 20 minutes because they realized that unless they had a common way of talking to each other about this complex stuff, they weren't going anywhere. So I invite you to take a look at that and see if it might be useful to you. Now, I get people who say, well, do you mean to suggest that we're going to have right words and wrong words and the language police and penalties and possible incarceration? And no, I am not suggesting that. But if you have people who want to use different words to label these ideas, it's perfectly okay. But what you can do is create the equivalent of the Rosetta Stone. You remember the Rosetta Stone from your history lessons? It was the tablet they found in the Nile Delta that helped them finally translate the hieroglyphics, because it had Greek and hieroglyphics on the same tablet. And you can create the equivalent of that by, again, saying, put the ideas down the left-hand column and say, well, look, group 1 wants to call it a result, but group 2 wants to call it an outcome. Group 3 wants to call it a goal. and you can create a translation guide back to the original idea. Over time, people might say, well, you know, having 3 different words that all mean the same thing is a little confusing. Maybe we could reach agreement on a single label for this idea. But in the meantime, you can respect people's right to talk however they want, but at least you'll know what it is they mean when they use those words. I want to share with you one other thing that came out of some work that I did on behalf of the Annie E. Casey Foundation in the States. That's the largest foundation in the United States devoted to helping disadvantaged children. And I was working on their behalf in Seattle, Washington. And in a particular neighborhood in the southwest quadrant of Washington called White Center, I was working with a group of neighborhood leaders who are going to go back and help organize community change processes in their communities. And White Center is a very interesting neighborhood. Like so many of our neighborhoods, it had at least 30 or 40 different refugee and immigrant populations, at least that many different languages spoken. And so at the end of the language conversation, I put on a piece of paper these 3 ideas: results, indicators, performance measures, and I invited people to come forward and write down the words that they would use in their first language to label these ideas, and this is what we came up with. So we now have results, indicators, and performance measures in Amharic, Cambodian, Laotian, Somali, Spanish, Tigrinya, and Vietnamese. So you see, this language discussion is not about English versus French versus Spanish. It's about us getting agreement on how we're going to label important ideas so that we can do this work together. So I want to go on to this first kind of accountability, population accountability. I want to share with you some examples of places that have articulated population quality of life ambitions for their city or community. This comes from Dunedin in New Zealand. New Zealand has a very interesting law that requires all of their local councils to have adopted a set of community outcomes, they call them, and they're a little bit different in each of those places. So in Dunedin, they came up with wealthy community, accessible city, safe and healthy city, sustainable city and environment, supportive, and so forth. This list comes from England. Some of you may have been following the work there on Every Child Matters. And these are 5 outcomes for children and young people that were written into the Children Act of 2004 in England. This comes from the state of Georgia. They identified 5 results: healthy children, children ready for school, succeeding in school, strong families, self-sufficient families. They didn't stop there. They went on to identify 26 indicators to measure whether they're getting these results or not. And they didn't stop there. They went on to create a report card for the state of Georgia and for each one of the 159 counties in Georgia, so that each of those counties could assess how they're doing for children and families compared to their neighbors and compared to the state. This is from work here in Ontario. I've been working with a lot of different municipalities and partnerships and other people in the various service sectors. This comes from work in their strategic plan of their ambitions for quality of life: a strong economy, vibrant and diverse community, green and growing city, and so forth. Now, the reason why you might want to articulate a set of results and identify a set of indicators to measure them at the population level is so that you can create a report card. These are report card covers from a number of different places. New Zealand has an excellent social indicators report card. Coventry in the UK is leading the way on creating report cards on the well-being of children and families. Santa Cruz, California has been doing this work for 15 years, one of the leaders of this work in the world. Jacksonville, Florida, I have a whole bookcase full of these. I've been trying to find, and these are some examples of report cards that have been developed recently here in Ontario. This is from the Niagara Partnership, living in Niagara, and this is from the Halton region on the well-being of children and families. Excellent work in both cases. I've been trying to find a report card on the well-being of immigrants and refugees in Canada, and I haven't been able to find one. I found this report, which is full of demographics, how many people, you know, male, female, nationality, and so forth, but didn't really tell me how many people were employed. It didn't tell me how many people felt welcomed or part of society. It didn't tell me the sort of basic things you want to know about whether people are being settled and becoming part of our society. I found this one, which is also an excellent report. Obviously, lots of great work from the Canadian Council for Refugees, but again, it didn't tell me the things I wanted to know about whether the programs that you all are working on are being successful or not at scale in terms of your society. Now, there may well be something like that that does that, and I would love to see that if you can point me to it. But the point I'm trying to make is not to criticize anyone, but rather to say that you may want to consider creating a report card on the well-being of refugees and immigrants in Canada, or refugees and immigrants in Ontario, or refugees and immigrants in your LIP area. How are we doing? How are they doing? There's lots of things we would want to know that if pulled together in one place, can be both a powerful statement of how we're doing and can also be a very useful advocacy document and way of drawing public attention to the issues that you're all dealing with. This is a look inside one of my favorite report cards. It comes from the state of Vermont. Vermont has identified 10 outcomes for people there, one of which is that pregnant women and young children thrive. And I want to show you this because it's a good model for thinking about how to do a report card. Each year they publish this 2-page presentation, and on the left-hand side for each of those outcomes, like pregnant women and young children thrive, they show first the heartening indicators, the ones they think they're doing well on, and then they show the troublesome indicators, the ones they're worried about. At the bottom of that page, they present the story behind those indicators. And then in the right-hand side, the first column are their accomplishments from last year, and the next column are their plans for the coming year. So very simple, accessible format that everyday citizens can understand. So as you think about the possibility of creating a report card on the well-being of immigrants and refugees, you might think of a structure like this. Now bear in mind, most report cards don't actually have the right-hand side action part. Most report cards just have the how are we doing part, the indicators and the story. They went ahead and put their action plan in the same document. So I told you earlier that the whole point of this work is to get from talk to action. And if you spend all the effort of creating a report card and publishing it and everything, and then you stop there, then you've just wasted a lot of time. Report cards are not the end of the process. The report cards are actually the beginning of the process. Assessing how we're doing is the starting point for the discussion about how we can do better and how we can get from talk to action. And I want to use a method of explaining this idea of talk to action from a lesson that I learned preparing for a conference in Tucson, Arizona. I was invited by the Arizona Department of Education to speak at their annual conference for career and technical education teachers. And I realized going into this conference I needed a less abstract and more down-to-earth way of talking about this, and it worked really well. So how many of you folks here have ever had a leaking roof? Wow, okay. How many of you currently have a leaking roof? Okay, all right, we'll pass the hat for you later on. Yes, okay, thanks. Now here's what will certainly seem like a silly question, but if you have a leaking roof, how do you know it's leaking? You can see the water dripping down, right? It's puddling on the floor, it's coming down the walls. We actually experience the leaking roof in some pretty obvious kinds of ways. Now, if we wanted to measure how badly it was leaking, what could you do? Yeah, put a pan or a bucket out, and after each rainstorm you could measure inches or centimeters of water in the pan or bucket. And that's what this graph is here. These 3 dots are the last 3 rainstorms. So after the first rainstorm, we had a little more than an inch of water in the bucket, and then a little bit more and a little bit more. Where do you think that line is headed if we don't do something about the roof? Okay. Through the roof, somebody once said. The roof is not going to fix itself. Now, this is my opportunity to introduce one more word, and it's the word baseline. And the word baseline, like all these other words, have many possible definitions. My definition of the word baseline comes from the world of budgeting. And budget baselines have 2 parts to them. They have a history part that says where we've been, in this case the last 3 rainstorms, and they have a forecast part, that yellow line, that says where are we headed if we don't do something different. Now, if you're living in this particular household, that future is not okay. You want to follow a path to 0 just as fast as you can, and this is the idea of turning the curve away from the baseline or beating the baseline. Now, what's the first thing you have to do when you're trying to fix a roof? What's the first thing you have to do? Find out where the leak is, right, exactly. And that's the next step in this process. What's the story behind the baseline? What are the causes that explain this picture of increasing water in the bucket? Now let's think about partners for a minute. Who are the partners that might be able to help you fix this roof? Who are some of those partners? A roofer, right? Your dad, okay, right? That's good. Family member. Somebody told me their kids would help. I did not believe them. Right? You know, the hardware store, you might need some help there. The insurance company, you might have a claim. The bank, you might need a loan. You know, friends and families and neighbors. So you have a lot of potential partners who might be able to help you. Now let's think about what works to actually fix a roof. When it comes to actually fixing the roof, what are your choices here? You have 2 big choices. What are they? Well, do-it-yourself is the partner's piece, okay? Actually fixing the roof, what are your choices about that? Patch or replace, that's right, exactly. And you have choices inside that. When it comes to patching it, you have choices about material, right? Tar, tile, duct tape, right? So we have choices about partners, and we have choices about what works to fix the roof, and out of those choices, we're going to create an action plan to fix the roof. Now, you won't call it an action plan, but that's what it'll be. You'll decide, I can't afford a whole new roof. My brother-in-law is going to come over this weekend. We're going to get up there. We're going to patch it up as best we can. So we implement this action plan, and then what do? Wait for the next rainstorm, right? Or you could take a hose and put it up on the roof and test it that way, right? What happens if after the next rainstorm, inches of water in the bucket is here? Is the roof fixed? No. So what do you do now? Well, you've got to go back through this process again. You missed the cause of the leak the first time, or maybe there were 2 leaks, but you only found one of them, right? You think about partners again. Well, we now know that my brother-in-law doesn't know anything about roofs. You think about what works. Well, maybe duct tape wasn't the best choice of patching material, right? And you create a second action plan, and you implement that second action plan, and then what do? You wait for the next rainstorm. This is an iterative or repetitive process until there's no more water in the bucket. This is the thinking process behind results-based accountability. This is it right here, folks. If you get this, we can stop now. It's the thinking process that we use in our everyday lives to solve problems. Now, we're going to apply this thinking process to things that are far more complicated and important than a leaking roof. We're going to apply this to the safety of our children, or the performance of important institutions like schools or hospitals or social service agencies, but it's the very same thinking process. Now, the 2 things I want to say about this before we leave it. The first is that you could have 0 inches of water in the bucket and the roof is still not fixed. Now the water is coming down the inside of one of the walls. You don't know that till 3 months later when the wall falls in. And the point that I'm trying to make there is that data is not the same thing as reality. We're using inches of water in the bucket as a piece of data, but the purpose of the work is not actually 0 inches of water in the bucket. The purpose of the work is actually a fixed roof. And we have to make sure that we don't put data up on a pedestal and make data the purpose of the work. Data is never the purpose of the work. It's only ever a tool that helps us approximate the conditions that we're trying to create. Now, the second thing I want to say about this before we leave it is that I don't know too many people who would create a graph like this if they had a leaking roof, right? And mostly we do things like fix leaking roofs without any data at all. We run the entire process off of experience. When we stop seeing water, we figure the roof is fixed, right? Well, now you could do that in your communities. You could say, well, I think children are safer here. I don't hear people talking so much about child abuse anymore. This hospital seems like it's working pretty well. People are smiling, going about their business. Somebody said thank you yesterday. You could run everything on observations, impressions, anecdotes, stories. But the truth of the matter is that when you're talking about something as complicated as the work that you all are trying to do, if you don't have data, you don't really know if things are getting better or worse. So data becomes a whole lot more important when we raise the stakes from fixing a leaking roof to these more important purposes in our society. So getting from talk to action at the population level starts with what are the quality of life conditions we want for the children, adults, families who live in our community? What are the quality of life conditions that you want for refugees and immigrants who live in your community? That's the starting point for this conversation. Question 2, what would those conditions look like if we could see them or hear them or feel them? If we're talking about children being safe, for example, we might experience that by talking to our kids at breakfast in the morning about whether they feel safe going to school or feel welcome in school, right? We might observe that by noting whether kids are wearing bike helmets as they ride their bikes around our neighborhoods. We know from research that failure to wear a bike helmet is the single leading cause of head injuries, serious head injuries among young children. So how do we experience these conditions? And then if we can figure out how we experience them, then we can say, well, how could we measure them? And we're going to be looking for 3 to 5 pieces of data for each of those quality of life conditions, safe, healthy, feeling welcome in our community, 3 or 5 pieces of data for each of those. For each of those measures, we want to then create a baseline. How are we doing on the most important of these measures? And so we create a baseline and tell the story behind the baseline. Question 5, who are the partners that have a role to play in doing better? Question 6, what works to do better? And question 7, what do we propose to actually do? Now, these 7 questions are the simplest set of questions I think you can ask and answer and still have a complete talk-to-action conversation at the population level. And these questions have been used in many places now to organize, to keep groups like yours from spinning their wheels, going around in circles endlessly, talking and talking and talking and never taking action. This is about getting those good intentions and that powerful base of knowledge and effort to actually lead to change for people. And my first example has to do with teen pregnancy. I thought you might find this quote interesting. This was a statement on the floor of the Colorado legislature. You couldn't make this stuff up, right? So the first example has to do with teen pregnancy. It comes from Tillamook County, Oregon. It's a little county on the northwest coast of Oregon. Back in the early 90s, the state of Oregon issued a report card comparing the teen pregnancy rates on their 36 counties. Tillamook County turned out to be second or third worst on that list. Came as a real shock to the people who lived there. They didn't realize they had a problem. Certainly not that bad compared to their neighbors. Now, about the time that this report card came out, there was a proposal on the table to build health clinics in the high schools in Tillamook County. This is a very conservative community, politically and socially. They didn't want health clinics in their high schools. So they said, okay, we give up. We're not going to have health clinics in our high schools, but what are we going to do about our problem with teen pregnancy? Notice the phrasing of that. What are we going to do about our problem? And one by one, different groups came forward to be part of this work. The schools weren't going to get health clinics, but they could retool the way they use their nurses and their other health professionals to focus on work with adolescents on matters of sexuality. The churches in the community at this time wanted to be part of this work. Now, they were not about to turn over their money to government, but they could sponsor supervised recreation between the hours of 3 and 6, which is when we know a lot of kids get into trouble. My favorite example here, however, comes from the public health department. They looked at their policies. They discovered that if a teenager came in and asked for an appointment, they got put on a waiting list. They got an appointment 3 weeks later. Do any of you folks have teenagers? Any of them show up 3 weeks later for anything, you know, let alone a health department appointment, right? So they changed their policy from 3 weeks to 48 hours. And I would have made it the same day, but they said 48 hours. About 12.5 different organizations did something as part of this work. And 3 or 4 years later, Tillamook County had the best teen pregnancy rate in the state of Oregon. You can see the rest of the state stayed more or less the same. Something different happened here. Here's a more recent example. This comes from Newcastle, an old industrial city in the north of England. All across England, they track a measure called NEAT, which stands for Not in Education, Employment, or Training. And the 16 to 18-year-olds who are not in education, employment, or training are the disengaged youth. Lots of problems go with that. Now, they have been tracking between 15 and 17% for 10 years going off the left-hand side of this chart. And somewhere in the middle of that chart, the woman who chaired the council, Sarah Morgan Evans, came to one of our workshops in the north of England. She went back to her council and she said, look, we've been having this partnership, not unlike yours, but in slightly different focus. She said, look, we've been having the same conversation every month for 10 years. Let's try something different. And so they began to use RBA. They began to dig into the story behind the curve. Who are these young people and why are they disengaged? They went out and talked to young people. Imagine that. They talked to people on the front lines. They gathered information about what was causing this problem to be what it was. They went and thought long and hard about the partners who ought to be at the table, who weren't at the table, and they went out and recruited those partners to come join them. They thought long and hard about what works. They studied the research and the best practice literature, but they also, again, talked to young people and they talked to frontline workers. And they created an action plan that wasn't just a static document, but it was something that they made better over time. It wasn't a bookshelf report, but something they made better over time. And they produced the biggest reduction of any local authority in England, from 15% down to 9.3%, and the most recent data down to 8.5%. So these are examples of places that have taken this disciplined approach of measuring how we're doing, working together from talk to actually produce action that makes those numbers get better. And so my question to you is this. What kind of story like these do you want to be able to tell about your community in 2 or 3 years? Because it is within your power, if you organize yourself and take these kinds of disciplined steps, to have a story like this, to tell about the well-being of refugees and immigrants in Canada, in Ontario, or in your community. So I want to move on to performance accountability. Remember, we started off talking about these 2 different kinds of accountability. I'm obviously doing sort of a shortened version of this presentation. We're going to move to the second version, performance accountability, and it turns out that one of the most difficult things about performance accountability is finding good cartoons, but I have a couple of them here. And as you might expect, they come from Dilbert. And this first cartoon is my all-time favorite cartoon about performance accountability. This metric shows an excellent trend in the number of days since the beginning of my project. Look at this. The number of days since his project started is going steadily upward. And then he's got the goal to say, and that growth rate compares favorably to the best companies in our time zone, and of course it's the same rate. So if you're desperate for a performance measure, folks, here it is. Number of days since you started. You'll always get that nice upward trend, you know. We've become very cynical about this whole business, and there was another Dilbert cartoon series where this pile of paper had gotten so high in somebody's office that it actually fell over and killed someone. I don't know if you saw that or not. But the last frame of the cartoon was, what did you do with the body? I enrolled it in the quality workshop next door. So we've gotten very cynical about this whole business. And I don't blame people for being cynical. I would be cynical too if I'd been exposed, as I was for those 19 years in government, to one useless process after another. So again, this notion that this is useful is really the core value here. I have one more cartoon before we start into performance accountability in detail. And this has 3 frames to it, so you kind of have to wait for the last frame. I didn't have any accurate numbers, so I just made this one up. Studies have shown that accurate numbers aren't any more useful than the ones you make up. How many studies showed that? 87. Yes, okay. So the approach to performance measurement in this framework starts with this idea, that all performance measures that have ever existed for any program in the history of the universe involve answering 2 sets of interlocking questions. And the first set of interlocking questions is quite familiar. How much did we do versus how well did we do it? These are the classic quantity and quality questions that we ask about our work. How much did we do? How well did we do it? Crossed against these 2 dimensions of the work itself. Effort, how hard did we try? And effect, is anyone better off as a consequence of our trying? A lot of discussion about performance measurement stops with effort. Right? We tried really hard, and we're really nice people. Give us more money, please. Right? If you run a budget process anywhere in the world, you recognize those 3 sentences make up 90% of budget justification. We tried hard, we're nice people, give us more money. It's actually pre-printed on some forms now. Trying hard is not good enough. That's where my book title comes from, and here is my pathetic attempt at subliminal advertising. And you can overlay these 2 perspectives and come up with a 4-quadrant or 4-part way of teasing apart the quantity and quality of effort and the quantity and quality of effect. Now, the quantity of effort is this question: how much service did we deliver? How many cases did we serve? How many hours of this and that service did we provide? How much of this and that activity did we perform? How much did we do? The quality of effort is this question: how well did we do all of those things? Were those services timely? Were they accessible? Were they culturally competent? But we can deliver a lot of service in a timely, accessible, and culturally competent way, and you still haven't answered the most important question: how much change for the better did we produce? More importantly, what was the quality of that change that we produced for people? These 4 questions collapse into these 3. How much did we do? How well did we do it? Is anyone better off? Number and percent. That's the theoretical derivation of where these numbers come from. And if you're interested in more of the theory behind this, you can find that in the book and in the online resources. Now, I want to give you a couple of examples of this to make it a little bit clearer. I always start with education because everybody's been through the education system. So how much did we do in education could be measured by number of students. Could also be measured by number of teachers, could be measured by hours of instruction, could be measured by dollars spent on education. So how much did we do? Those are examples there. How well did we do it in education could be measured by the student-teacher ratio. We know 20 to 1 is better than 30 to 1. Could be measured by the percentage of faculty that have degrees in the subjects that they're teaching, or the quality of the physical plant. But we can teach a lot of students at a very low ratio with highly qualified teachers in a very nice building, and you still haven't answered the most important question: how are the young people doing? And so down in the lower left, we ask, well, what was the number of kids who graduated from high school? But wait a minute, what does that mean? 300 kids graduated last year. Does the number 300 mean anything? Not so much. What we really want to know is the percent. Was it 50% or 70% or 80%? And we could push ourselves a lot harder in the education community by asking what was the number and percentage of 9th graders who graduated on time 4 years later and entered college or employment after graduation. That might be a really tough measure of the effect we have on young people's lives. Here's a typical pediatric practice. How much did we do? Number of persons or families treated. How well did we do it? Perhaps the percent who had to wait less than 30 minutes in the waiting room. But one of the things you want to know, and if you're running a pediatric practice, is the number and percentage of children who are fully immunized in your practice. Right? Not the whole community. The immunization rate in the whole community is population accountability. But the percent who are immunized in your practice, that's performance accountability for your practice. Here's a typical drug and alcohol treatment program. How much did we do? Number of persons treated. How well did we do it? Perhaps the percentage of staff with advanced training and certification. But what you really want to know if you're running a treatment program is the number and percentage of people who are off of alcohol and drugs at program exit. 12 months later, if you could get that data. This, in the lower right quadrant, is what's really important because that's where we measure whether people's lives are different. So I took a look at some statistics from the service reports I could find on the web. And so this is a client support services composite for a refugee resettlement and assistance. So how much did we do? Number of refugees served, number of refugee families served. Could also be a number of immigrants served or immigrant families served. How well do we do at unit cost per family, or the percentage of families that have a settlement plan within 2 weeks of entry. But you can do all of those things. You can have a settlement plan, you can have a low unit cost, but what you really want to know are things about the well-being of your customers, the percentage of families that have a wage earner in stable living wage employment, or the percentage who are in stable housing within 6 months of entry, or the percentage of children in these families that have good school attendance. Those are the kinds of changes and improvements in people's lives that you're trying to make when you work with individual customers. I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense, sort of, as a way of thinking about some of this for some of the services that you're working on? We can come back to this when we get to questions in a minute. Not just health and education and social services, though, by the way. It's, these ideas have been applied really across all of government. And so here's an example from a fire department. How much did we do? Number of times we responded to an alarm. How well did we do it? Response time, we know 3 minutes is better than 3 hours. But down at the bottom is a set of measures that fire departments around the world are actually using, the number and percentage of fires that are kept to the room of origin. Because if you think about it for a minute, who are the customers of the fire department? And one answer to that question is they're people whose buildings are on fire. And this is a measure that helps you judge the extent to which you've been able to contain the damage to that building. Now notice that the ability to keep fires to the room of origin is not just the responsibility of the fire department in this case, because it involves things like smoke detectors and the education system and a whole range of other partners. But that's an important measure for the fire department and gauging the extent to which they've been successful to their customers. So why in the world would you want to sort performance measures for your program or service into these 4 categories? And the answer to that question is quite simple. These 4 quadrants are not equally important. This upper left quadrant where we count how many people we served, how much of this and that activity did we perform, that is the least important quadrant. And yet we get some people who spend their entire careers living in the upper left quadrant, counting cases, counting activities. Somehow we've got to push the discussion down here to whether people are better off or not, and how could we observe that, and how could we measure that. And also of great importance, are we doing a good job delivering on the quality of services that we've promised? We're going to take our most important performance measures from the upper right and lower right quadrants. So not all of these measures are equally important. How much did we do is the least important, and how well is anyone better off is the most important kind of measure. Now there's lots more to say about this, but I do want to make one more point about the subtext of this field. Matter of control. If people are not talking about this, then they're thinking about it, because it turns out that as you go from the upper left quadrant to the lower right quadrant, first of all, you have progressively less and less data, right? It's much easier to count how many people we served in the upper left quadrant than it is to count whether they're better off in the lower right quadrant. But it is also true that you have progressively less and less control over how good you look on that data. And the classic example is recidivism rates for adult and juvenile corrections programs. And I get some corrections officials who bristle at being held accountable for recidivism or repeat offense rates, because it has a lot more to do with the things that happened outside the facility than anything that ever happened inside the facility, right? I would argue that recidivism rates are perfectly legitimate lower right quadrant measures for corrections programs, but if you want to look good on those measures, you need partnerships every bit as much as when we're talking about this cross-community stuff. You better be partnering with the people outside the walls of your jail or prison if you want to look good on repeat offense rates. Hospitals better be partnering with the people outside the walls of the hospital if they want to look good on patient recovery. Schools better be partnering with the people outside the walls of the school building if they want to look good on student achievement. I get some people who say to me, if I don't control it 100%, it's not a valid measure of my service. Have any of you folks ever said that? Thought it privately to yourself, maybe? I ask you, think of one thing, anything in your personal or professional lives that you control 100%. The best answer I ever got to this question was my goldfish. I had some guy who thought of himself as God to his goldfish, you know, but I had little kids. We had goldfish. You wake up the next morning, they're belly up in the tank, right? The fish, not the kids. The truth of the matter is there's nothing in our lives that we control 100%. If control is the overriding criteria for performance measures, well, then there are no performance measures. Congratulations, you're off the hook. Somehow we've got to get used to this paradox, and it is a paradox, that as we go from the least important stuff to the most important stuff, we go from having the most control to having the least control. And this is another reason why people spend their entire careers living in the upper left quadrant, counting cases and activity. It's fear. It can actually be scary to look at those better off measures in the lower right quadrant. But then you ask people, well, now, why did you go into this profession in the first place? Why did you become a social worker? Why did you become a teacher? Why did you become a public health nurse? The answers are all in that lower right quadrant. I wanted to make a difference in people's lives. And what do we measure? How many people did we serve? And funders are part of the problem. You fill out your monthly or quarterly report back to your funders, and what do they ask you? How many people did you serve, right? Funders oftentimes don't even know how to ask the better offness question. But I'll tell you something, if you can get good at this, if you can get good at talking about how you've made your customers' lives better, in addition to all the important stories you can tell, but if you can back that up with statistics, you're going to be much more successful with your funders. Because whether they can articulate it or not, that's why they're giving you the money. And the people who are the best at articulating impact on customers' lives are going to do the best when it comes to money competition. I'm going to skip a few more things here. I don't want to skip the cartoons. However, this is my targeting cartoon. Bummer of a birthmark, Hal. There's lots to be said about targeting and how targets are overused and misused, and we can come back to that in the question and answer section. If you take a look at page 27, you'll find a page that summarizes the kinds of measures that you find in the different quadrants. So we have, in the upper left quadrant, we typically count customers and we count activities. And you can break customers out by demographic characteristics or activities out by type of activity. In the upper right quadrant, there are a whole bunch of common measures that apply to many different services. So rather than start with a blank sheet of paper, take a look at this. Chances are some of these will apply to your work. Unit cost, and percentage of customers who sees a worker who speaks their language. There are lots of measures in there that apply to many different services. And in addition to the common measures, there are activity-specific measures that tell how well the activities on the left are performed. So if the activity on the left is number of telephone calls answered, well, the measure on the right, the activity-specific measure, might be the percent that are answered on the second ring or better. If the activity on the left is number of settlement plans produced, well, then the activity on the right might be the percent that are produced within 2 weeks of entry or within 3 weeks of entry or are produced with full family participation. So activities and activity-specific measures, how well those activities are performed. But again, we can answer how much do we do and how well do we do it. You still haven't answered the most important question, is anyone better off? And in the lower quadrants, these measures are almost always in number and percentage pairs of the very same thing. Remember how we had number off of drugs and then percent off of drugs. And we had number who graduated and then percent who graduated. It's exactly the same wording, but number on the left, percent on the right. And these better offness measures almost always have to do with these 4 dimensions of whether people are better off or not: skills and knowledge, attitude, opinion, behavior, and circumstance. Skills and knowledge we measure all the time in job training programs and in the education system, but you can do it with any kind of training or work that you do. Attitudes, we can measure attitudes about self-esteem. We can measure opinions about whether people have been treated well or not. Behavior, we can look at acting out behavior, runaway behavior, violent behavior, attendance behavior. And circumstance, we can look at whether people are in stable housing or they have living wage jobs. So this is a kind of a guide to the kind of measures that you find in these 3 different categories. How much did we do? How well did we do it? Is anyone better off? Again, notice that those categories, I just want to say more and more thing about them, are categories that everyday citizens can understand and elected officials can understand. You know, you start throwing all the jargon around, input, output, outcome, all the jargon that we've been using in this field, you lose people pretty much immediately. But how much did we do? How well did we do it? Is anyone better off? Those are ways of talking about this stuff that everyone can understand and relate to, and it's a complete system. Now I want to go, we're going to skip this little exercise here. Come back to this later if we have time. I want to go to page 28. And this is now the talk-to-action thinking process for performance accountability, and it's, again, in the form of 7 questions. So getting from talk to action in performance starts with question 1, who are our customers? All performance measurement systems must start with this question. It will almost always be true that you have more than one customer group, and your customer groups often have competing or even conflicting interests. And my favorite example of that comes from when I worked with the Alaska Fish and Game Commission. They have as customers the fishermen and the fish. You will never find two customer groups with less in common than that. Now, the way they solved this problem actually was that their lower right quadrant performance measure was about sustainable yield. It was a measure that directly measured this balancing act they did between their customer groups. So who are our customers? Very important starting point. Might be useful for you to distinguish primary versus secondary, direct versus indirect, or internal versus external, and any of those distinctions are fine. Question 2, how could we measure if our customers are better off? And these are the lower right quadrant measures. You may want to put a little LR or some notation next to question 2 to remind yourself that question 2 is about those lower right, is anyone better off measures. Question 3, how can we measure for delivering service well? These are the upper right quadrant measures. You may want to put a little UR or some notation after question 3. Question 4, how are we doing on the most important of these measures? Now, there are two parts to this. The first part is the most important of these measures part. This signifies a willingness to winnow down to the 3 to 5 most important measures. Very important for programs and services to know what are the 3 to 5 most important measures of all the things you measure. What are the most important? And the how are we doing part is about creating baselines for those 3 to 5 measures and telling the story behind the baseline. Question 5, who are the partners that have a role to play in doing better? Question 6, what works to do better? And question 7, what do we propose to actually do? These 7 questions, I believe, are the simplest set of questions you can ask and answer and still have a complete performance system. And it is my view that these questions should be asked and answered at every intersection between a supervisor and a subordinate throughout the system. I know a number of you folks most certainly supervise other people. Imagine if before your next supervisory conference you handed out these 7 questions. You said, look, we're going to spend the first 15 minutes of our next supervisory conference, not the last 15 if we have time, but the first 15, on your best answers to these questions. I don't expect you to get it perfect, just try it. And then we're going to have that discussion every time we get together for the rest of your life, okay? That this is not a one-time conversation, but it's something we're going to do on a regular basis. And if you were to do that, you would begin to change the culture of your organization, and that's what we're talking about here, culture change. I want to make one more note here that I didn't talk about, and you'll see in question 6 a reference to including no-cost and low-cost ideas. Very important that we think about no-cost and low-cost ideas in addition to all the things that cost money. Very powerful idea, and if you give people permission to think about no-cost, low-cost idea, you're more likely to get a complete set of actions. We again have lots of examples of where this has worked for services. This comes from North Lincolnshire in England, where they had a problem with vacancy rates in their public housing. And my friend Mike Pinnock used these methods to turn the curve on vacancy rates in public housing. This is Dayton, Ohio, where they had a problem with declining school attendance, and they used these methods to turn the curve on school attendance. This is very interesting from Cardiff in Wales. This is the Epilepsy unit, where they looked at the percentage of patients seen by a specialist in 2 weeks and the number of admissions to hospital for seizure. And they were getting worse in the case of seen by a specialist, and they were able to use these methods to turn those numbers back up. And in the case of admissions for seizure for epilepsy, they were getting better, but getting better too slow, and they were able to drive the admissions to hospital to practically 0, again, using these methods. So we have a growing portfolio of examples where people came together around a particular service and thought about how their customers were better off, and they were actually able to produce this kind of measurable improvement. So how do population and performance fit together? The last slide I want to show you. Population at the top and performance at the bottom. Population, we have healthy births, stable families, children ready for school, and we have indicators to go with that, the rate of low birth weight babies, the rate of child abuse and neglect, a percentage of children ready for kindergarten entry. At the bottom, I picked a particular service, a prenatal nutrition program, and put it through the 4-quadrant lens. So how much did we do, number of women served or number of families served? How well do we do with the number percentage of attendance at these program services or unit cost. But what you really want to know, or one of the things you want to know, is the number and percentage of low birth weight births for the participating women. Again, not for the whole community, just for those in your program. Well, now look here. Down in the lower right quadrant, we have a rate of low birth weight births. And up at the top, under the very first thing, you'll see rate of low birth weight births. This is not an accident. This is a powerful and important relationship because it turns out that sometimes the only difference between a lower right quadrant performance measure for a program or service and a population indicator is the difference in scale between a customer population at the bottom and the total community population at the top. Sometimes it's the very same measure. Now, the reason why this is important, and this is the key point, is it allows you to talk about what you do for your customers as your contribution to community. And that's the relationship between these two different kinds of accountability, a contribution relationship. What you do to make your customers' lives better is your contribution to population quality of life. I'm going to stop there. I know I've run over a little bit in time, but we do want to leave some time for questions.